welcome to everyone to this session. My name is Josh Cohen. I teach at Apple University and at University of California, Berkeley, and I'm co-editor of Boston Review. And I'm going to be chairing this session of our meeting in which we continue on the democratized theme in our discussion of work. And the name of the session is "Where is the Voice of Workers in the Globalized Economy, the Current Crisis?" Now, where in that title, "Where is the Voice," stands for a vast range of fundamental issues beyond the obvious ones of location. It's a kind of abbreviation for which workers doing what kinds of jobs, located in what places and jurisdictions, expressing their many voices, how, through what collective means, in what venues, saying what, acting how, and facing what kinds of hurdles and threats. It's obviously a very large topic, and it lies at the heart of this theme of democratizing work, because when we think about a project of democratizing work, one focus is on thinking about attractive organizational and institutional schemes for a more democratic ordering of firms and of jobs. But those schemes, those attractive schemes, need to connect to the aspirations, individual and collective, of working people acting together in different places to demand the treatment that they are owed, thus our subject. And we have three fantastic people to address these important and vast issues. And each of them will speak for 10 minutes in the order in which I'm about to introduce them. And then after they speak, we'll have about 20 minutes for conversation. And please put your questions not in chat, but in the Q&A, click the Q&A tab. Okay. So first, we'll have Dr. Ewan McGaughey, who's a reader. Did I get it right, Ewan?
Perfect.
Good enough. Good enough for California work. He's a reader at King's College, London, specializes in law, economics, and history, and is involved in the labor movement. Ewan completed a PhD at LSE on worker and investor participation in corporate governance in the UK, the EU, Germany, and the US. He's also a research associate at the University of Cambridge, the Center for Business Research. He teaches each year at the Paris School of Economics and is an advocate in labor tribunals for the Free Representation Unit. His core research interests are economic and social rights, particularly as they pertain to the governance of enterprises. So Ewan will speak first, and then we'll have Isabelle who was elected Confederal Secretary of the European Trade Union Confederation at the 14th Congress in Vienna in May 2019. She heads the European Trade Union Confederation policy on workers' participation and EWC's industrial policy and company law, competition and labor law, internal market and legislation, digitalization, standardization, public services, and corporate social responsibility. From 2005 to 2016, she was senior researcher with the European Trade Union Institute in Brussels, covering European social dialogue and European and comparative labor law, corporate governance and workers' participation, fundamental social rights, and impacts of the 2008 financial crisis on workers' rights. The third presentation will be from Ben Sachs, who's a Kestenbaum Professor of Labor and Industry at Harvard Law School, leading expert in the field of labor law and labor relations. Ben teaches courses in labor law, employment law, law and social change, and his writing focuses on union organizing and unions in American politics. Before he came to the Harvard faculty, a little more than a dozen years ago, he was the Joseph Goldstein Fellow at Yale Law School. Prior to that, 2002 to 2006, He serves as Assistant General Counsel of the SEIU, the Service Employees International Union. Before that, attorney at Make the Road by Walking, a membership-based community organization in Brooklyn, New York. He graduated from Yale Law School in 1998. He clerked for the Honorable Stephen Reinhardt of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in the United States, and his writing has appeared in Harvard Law Review, Yale Law Journal, Columbia Law Review, New York Times, and elsewhere. He has received a teaching award at Yale Law School, and it was the recipient of the Sachs Freund Award for Teaching Excellence at Harvard Law School, and won the Charles Fried Intellectual Diversity Award in 2015, which came with the responsibility of giving a talk to the Federalist Society. Ben's only appearance in the talk at the Federalist Society. I said that it was a vast topic, but now that you've heard about the each of these three and all of them together, you can see that we picked exactly the right people to cover the vastness of the subject. Ewan, why don't you start us off?
Thank you very much, Joshua. Can you all hear me okay? I think so. Okay, great. I'm delighted to be here with this panel, with Ben and Isabelle and Joshua. Thank you for the introduction. I'm also very pleased to be with all of the people that I can't see through the screen, but I hope there will be a good discussion afterwards. And it's great to be talking in such a fantastically organized conference with so many people about such an important topic as democratizing the workplace. And I think what we're really talking about is the creation of a new suffrage movement for the 21st century, and that's to be able to get the right to vote in the economy just as much as politics. So the question for this session today is, where is the voice of workers in the globalized economy? And I think that's a very good question because, as I say, we've got this fundamental disjunct between more or less democratic politics in the majority of countries and economic absolutism, a contrast between political freedom on the one hand, and when you walk through the factory or the office door, your freedom being very constrained and people having very little voice in the power that is exercised over them. So what I'd like to do in the next few minutes, and am I right, Joshua, we've got about 10 minutes? Is it about 10 minutes? Yeah. I'm going to base my remarks on a paper that is just coming out in the King's Law Journal on the International Labour Organization and economic democracy and the need to democratize the employer, in which I very tentatively drafted a model ILO convention, an International Labour Organization convention for economic democracy, something that I think that we're lacking and could be very useful as we see a proliferation of laws to democratize the workplace. So my remarks are going to be grouped into three main parts. The first part is I'm just going to say a very brief few words by way of introduction about labour standards and the absence of an international labour organisation standard on workplace democracy or economic democracy. Second, I'm going to say a little bit more historically about why that might be the case in the history of the International Labour Organization, and the fact that there were three conceptions of industrial democracy back in 1919 when the ILO was founded. And the third thing that I'm going to do is just summarize some of the main parts of what a system of economic democracy could look like based on what we already see as best practice today. And that means votes at work for who's on a board of directors or an equivalent enterprise governing body, votes through work councils that carve out specific management functions within the workplace, and the democratization of workers' capital, particularly through pension funds or any other kind of capital fund. So the first thing that I'd like to start with is the idea of what a voice in the globalized economy could mean. So we all know that in a globalizing economy, what we need to support the economy is a globalizing legal framework. Because if there is an absence of rules, if you have free movement of capital, labor, goods and services, there could potentially be a race to the bottom in standards. Now, that isn't the empirical reality of how labour rights actually work in a globalising world, or within Europe, in the European Union, where there's widespread freedom of movement. Because what we know is that when standards can be raised through democratic action, there can be a reflexive system of feedback between higher standards and flexibility in movement of factors of production. I mean, so it's just not the case that we have all raced to the bottom, as it could be if there were no democratic governments that could have standards and no rules at all. So the idea of reflexivity in the creation of better labour standards is important for the International Labour Organization, because one of the things that the ILO does is it can spread ideas of what constitutes best practice. But one of the surprising facts is that although we've got core labour conventions on freedom of association, on anti-discrimination, no forced labour and no child labour, and then we've got a host of other non-core conventions, if you like, on job security, health and safety and so forth. There's a conspicuous lack of anything on co-determination rights. And that's even more surprising given the fact that a majority of OECD countries have some form of law for votes on the board of directors, work councils, participation in capital funds to differing degrees. And I'll just give you a few examples of some of the big ones. So these aren't nation states, but regional groupings, or one of them is a nation state. But in the European Social Charter, Article 22 says workers have the right to take part in the determination and improvement of working conditions and working environment in an undertaking. Okay, so that's every country that is part of the Council of Europe, Article 22 of the European Social Charter. And we know, of course, that a majority of EU countries have co-determination laws. India, in Article 43A of its constitution, says the state shall take steps by suitable legislation to secure the participation of workers in the management of undertakings, establishments, or other organisation engaged in any industry. And we see, of course, I mean, that was a sort of programmatic norm which has to be rolled out through legislation, but the principle is there. We see a rule in China for 1/3 co-determination on the board of directors. We see a provision for co-determination in the Brazilian constitution. And we see a host of proposals, not only a tiny bit in Britain, but conspicuously and particularly in the United States with the 2020 election. We saw two leading presidential candidates, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, putting forward very comprehensive plans for worker participation in corporate governance. We see Kamala Harris, current vice president, of course, signing on to the idea that the SEC should investigate or set up an investigation into co-determination. And this is an idea that's becoming mainstream. There's no shortage of federal proposals, and states could do the same thing. And of course, since Ben is here, there's this wonderful clean slate report that set out ways in which these principles could be implemented as part of a comprehensive plan to remake US labour law. So out of the biggest polities around the world, the idea of co-determination is widespread. It's embedded, as I say, in a majority of OECD countries. And so it's very odd, therefore, that we have such a silence when it comes to International Labour Organization conventions. And I think that, and this is the second part of what I want to say, I think that one of the reasons that might be is because when the International Labour Organization was founded in the Versailles Treaty of 1919, there were three very, very different conceptions of what industrial democracy could be. Most of the leading industrial nations at the end of World War I their labour movements and their labour scholars were very involved in this sort of narrative of what an industrial democracy could look like. But there were three main ways in which it was actually tried and tested and often fell apart after World War I. First of all, in Britain, with Sidney and Beatrice Webb, in their famous book Industrial Democracy, the main model used after the war for what that could mean, how you could get worker voice in the economy, was implemented through a system of, if you like, institutionalized collective bargaining. So sectoral councils were set up, known as Whitley councils or joint industrial councils, and those brought together employers and unions, and they were told, we'll come up with a collective agreement for your sector. If you don't, the Ministry of Labour will use its default wage setting powers to fix wages across your industry. So agree it yourselves, or if we're not, we're going to fix it. And that was quite successful in spreading a system of sectoral collective bargaining. But after a series of cuts in 1922 by a Conservative government, the system eroded and collapsed until being revitalized in the early 30s and then functioning after World War II. So that was the first model of industrial democracy. It was sectoral collective bargaining institutionalized. The second one in Germany was, actually I might say America first, the second one in America was, I think, primarily seen through the War Labor Board set up at the end, or the end of the war, 1918, lasting roughly a year or maybe two into 1919. And what this War Labor Board was meant to do was effectively work as a quasi-judicial appeal body, so that if workplace disagreements couldn't be settled, then this sort of quasi-judicial appeal body could settle disputes. However, that was very short-lived as well, because with the change in the political composition of the Senate, more Republican senators, it was defunded and then it wasn't continued. But the idea of institutionalized litigation this time was something that the American conception of industrial democracy at that time was focused on. The third one was what happened in Germany. And at the end of World War I, again, when the ILO was being founded, the Weimar Constitution was written to say that workers should have a right to co-determine every level of economic planning, or every level of economic decision-making. So co-determination was there in principle in the Weimar Constitution, and then it was rolled out through at least two major acts of Parliament after the war. The first was called the Supervisory Council Act of 1922, which started to put at least a couple of workers elected to the board. But perhaps even more significant, there was a Work Council Act, the Betriebsrätegesetz, which enabled workers to have decision-making power over job security rights and other social rights at work, things that closely concerned them. So you see, that model of industrial democracy was different again. It was about the direct right to vote at work, to vote in your work council, to vote on the board of directors, as part of this larger aspiration for participation at every level of economic management. But
Ewan, if I could nudge you just a little bit on the time, I apologize for interrupting.
Is time up? How long do I have? Okay. Okay. Well, I'll wrap up very quickly. Just 1 or 2 minutes more.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Perfect. Thank you.
And thanks for the reminder. Okay, so there were three different conceptions at the time of the ILO's founding. Throughout the 20th century, therefore, nation states experimented in lots of different ways. And so, but now we have a wealth of experimentation, we have a wealth of different models that we can use. And this could inform us about what an economic democracy convention of the ILO could look like. The first thing would be about directors on boards. Now, there's lots of different models, and I suppose the dominant model would be about 1/3 of boards are elected in most OECD countries. But we see higher, we see lower. And more importantly, at universities where many of us work, we see majority representation for workforces on university boards. That's true in Oxford, in Cambridge. American universities are a bit different. There's lots of different varieties, lots of different models, but that would be one main element. The second main element would be work councils with binding rights in management. So one of the most important things that work councils do is they have influence over job security rights. And again, universities provide a very good model. Academic senates, academic boards often protect the tenure of staff, but also do other things like determine breaks, determine workplace social arrangements, and also this is where pension co-determination originally came from. The third main element would be control over workers' capital. So co-determination in workers' capital starts usually with workers saving for retirement in a pension fund or some other kind of insurance or retirement fund. The standard in the UK is 1/3 of pension funds have to be elected members or union appointed members. Canada has more collective agreements where it's half-half, union employer controlling the fund. America has a big variety, old union funds, a majority or completely controlled, public pensions, maybe 1/3 on average. And so we see a lot of different models that can be drawn upon for control of workers' capital. So those would be the three main elements in an economic democracy constitution. But the most important thing is that we have some kind of standards and a conversation begun globally about where the voice of workers could be. Thanks very much for letting me go over a bit.
No, that's fantastic. That was really tremendous. Thanks so much, Ewan. A great way to get us started. Isabelle, off to you.
Hugh, can you hear me?
If you could turn up the volume a little bit.
Okay, I do my best. And here, is it better now?
Yes, that's good on my side. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay. Just would like to thank you very much for the invitation, and in particular for this very timely discussion. And I'm very much looking forward to those days of exchanges. It's always very important for the European trade movement to be able to look out of the box, so to say, and to be able to learn out of, as was mentioned, historical evolution and comparison of what is happening in the world. And of course, the idea is clearly here to look and focus a bit on the role of the European Union in shaping democracy at the workplace, which is one of the main tasks I have during these 4 years of being elected at the level of the ETUC as Confederate Secretary in charge of, amongst other, democracy at work. And it's on the top of that, I think it's very good to look at this dimension in terms of, the impact of the crisis. And I think this is also one of the dimensions that we should look at. And to build on one of the famous sentences that I have so much along the crisis, which is not over, is that you shouldn't waste a good crisis. And so are we moving ahead with the issue of democracy at work? And in particular, and this is what I would like to stress today, democracy and democracy at work. I think we have to link the two, and so we have to make clear that democratic principles and democratic structure are the foundations of the European Union. I think from the very outset, it has been a very strong signal after the Second World War in terms of social cohesion, through economic cohesion. And I think this is clearly, and what we understand today, not only with the crisis, but also with the crisis, is that we also have to have an environmental cohesion, so that we are able also to move ahead. And clearly here, we have to be very careful and vigilant when it comes to those democratic principles and those democratic values, because it seems that it's not shared anymore among the European member states, and share at the same level as it was back in time, and it should be to look into the future to make it sustainable. And this is one dimension that this vigilance has to take place at different levels. We understand the institutional level, being European, being national, being local, be it at the workplace, but also the exercise of democracy and how to exercise those rights. I think they are key, and for us it is clear that they have to be regulated. They have to be framed in a way that it's bring the basis for all, so that we are working on the very famous word for the moment in the European Union, the level playing field. That is the basis for all, that do not that secure that we do not go or reduce the existing rights, but we move forward. What we call upwards convergence, and this is of course what we are looking at. And this is certainly what we see, that this regulation of how democracy could be strengthen its foundations, but also exercised in a way which is respectful of those principles and respectful of the challenges we have to face. This has to be clearly set and addressed, exactly because there is attempt to undermine those foundations. And of course, democracy does live with the exercise of it. So, it's not just that you go once every year, every 4 years, or 5 years, depending on where you are, and for what kind of level you are going to exercise your democratic vote. You can exercise, after having voted and delegated your vote to certain instances, you can exercise your vote on a daily basis. You can exercise your democratic rights on a daily basis, and in particular the workplace. And this is where we have seen that throughout the crisis, where democracy at work was based on sound basis. Germany was one. We could name others in Europe, the Nordic countries, for example. We could even mention France, where democracy is lively, where democracy is exercised respectfully inside the enterprises. It has delivered for the sake of the better protection of workers in very critical times, but also for the respect of the structure of the business. And this is also in respect of, to maintain the business throughout the crisis. And I think this one has been one of the revealing crises that has hit much more than in 2008. I think here we have seen that one of the dimensions of exercising these rights at the workplace was to protect people, not just to protect business and their interests or banks. The people, each of us was placed again at the center of the decision that had to be taken at the workplace, up to the national level, up to the European level, and I will stay here, in terms of providing the necessary protection for workers and providing the necessary structure jointly for business to be maintained. So I think here the crisis has shown how essential democracy and democracy at work is to maintain the cohesion. And here we speak about the social and the economic cohesion in a very difficult time we've never experienced so far. And one of the second point I would like to mention is that this democracy, the exercise of those democratic rights have also shown how much value and appreciation of the work of each and every individuals in society has been. And especially those social workers that no one sees or no one value very much during, good times. And this is also where we have to learn the lessons from this crisis. So one of the lessons would be to bring back people in the center of the decisions we are making at the business level. So not to make first decision for profit, but to replace the individuals and especially the workers. They are constituencies of their business. They are not any stakeholders out there. They are the constituency of the businesses. So to replace those in the center of the decision-making processes, and of course to make them participate. And here it has been mentioned, we have some tools. We have very important tools, but we're missing one essential one. And in particular, when we look at the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, which is legally binding for the European institutions and for the national member states, we are missing this dimension of participation. We have the information, we have the consultation. In one directive, we have consultation in a view to reaching an agreement, which is clearly heading at these participations. But we are missing this element, and we are fighting for that to be put on the top of the agenda of policy in the European Union. And this is where we see that one of the very important lessons of this crisis is to move ahead with this dimension in different instances that we are, for which we have a momentum now. And of course, it goes toward recognizing that democracy and democracy at work participate to a common good in society, participate to the humanization of the workplace, likewise to social justice, and of course to the environmental dimension for which we, the climate neutrality for which we're all working, and in particular the workers at the workplace. And this is the reasons why the European Trade Union Movement, and in particular the ETUC, backed up by its 90 national confederations and 10 European federations, about 45 million workers out there, are backed up to propose and promote, together with the European Parliament, which is in the making in terms of a European Parliament report on a new framework for information, consultation, participation, where indeed one of the proposals raised by Ewan is indeed looked into in terms of securing the participations as a ratio of the size of the business, the participation of workers in the board level, depending on the size of the worker. But of course, it's not the only dimension we are looking at. You mentioned the European Works Council. We need to reinforce this very important body, which is one of the elements, and I put one of the feature of democracy at work, looking at transnational elements and decision processes, which is the European Works Council. And we need, 10 years after the last directive, we need to update and to reinforce the European Works Council directive. And for that, there is very much reluctance, you can imagine, at the European level, coming from the institutions, likewise from the business side. And the last, which is, to my point of view, the more promising initiative that the Commission should finally put on the table, is exactly the draft directive on mandatory human rights due diligence and responsible business conduct that we are expecting since June, and for which the trade union movement now has waited too long, I must say, and for which we are launching tomorrow a countdown, because we can't accept that the Commission is waiting and preparing without much transparency on what is already should have been prepared in June, whereby France, since 2017, is on board with a very important piece of legislation. Germany has managed this year to adopt a legislation. The Belgian colleagues are on board and already discussing a national legislation on due diligence. And here again, the objective is to put back the human dimension in the center of the decisions, and to make clear, and to come back to one of the very key principles that Ewan has mentioned. Labor is not a commodity. And I think we have to be clear, what does that mean? And this is exactly through those very important initiatives to replace the human and the human rights in the forefront that we will move forward and bring democracy at the workplace at the level it should be, and at the level it has to be, to organize the recovery after the pandemic, and to reorganize the resilience we need to face in terms of facing the next challenges. And one of them, we all know, is to move toward climate neutrality and safe jobs in most of the sector of the economy. We know they're going to be very difficult. Thank you.
Good. Thank you so much, Isabelle, for those illuminating remarks, and particularly for ending on that note of needs to be done yesterday, not tomorrow. The sense of urgency that you landed on is very helpful. Thank you so much. Ben, to you now.
Great. So I'll try to be quick. And I thought I would talk about labor law and specifically, and how labor law can offer workers a voice by which I think I really mean power in the economy. And I'll use the US as an example. I'm going to start by describing the crisis of economic and political democracy in the US, and then talk about how labor law might do something about this. This is going to give me the chance to talk a little bit about the Clean Slate for Worker Power project, which Ewan mentioned, which has been the focus of our work at Harvard for the last few years. I'm going to close by saying a few quick words about what stands in the way of a labor law like this in the United States, the roadblocks to progressive legal change, both in the legislature and more particularly in the courts. So for those maybe not quite familiar, the degree of inequality that's now plaguing American life is staggering. This is true of material resources. The richest 20 people in the United States have more wealth than half the nation put together. One statistic I like is that it would take an Amazon worker here about 4 million years working full-time to earn what Jeff Bezos now has. The vast disparity in material wealth obviously means that millions and millions of American families struggle just to get by. It's all too common today to work full-time and still live in poverty. For our purposes today, what's worse is that this economic inequality translates seamlessly into political inequality as the wealthy use their material resources to influence government policy. Here, with respect to the crisis of political democracy, the statistics are, I guess, if possible, even starker. Put simply, when it comes to policymaking in the United States, the government no longer pays any attention to what the poor and middle class want. The government listens to the very wealthiest, and more policy here reflects the preferences of the vast majority of Americans only by coincidence. That is, only when those preferences happen to line up with the views of the wealthy. The dire assessment by political scientists is that today in America, the majority does not rule. Worse still, and again relevant for our discussion today, these dual crises of economic and political democracy reinforce each other, creating a vicious cycle. So as economic wealth gets more and more concentrated, the wealthy build greater and greater political power that they in turn convert into government policy that enables them to build more wealth and then more political power, and on and on. So the question is how to break this spiral, a spiral that threatens both the economic survival of the poor and middle class, and that poses a dire risk to the future of democracy. That's the question we set out to address in the Clean Slate project. We brought together more than 70 academics, lawyers, and policymakers, many of whom are on this call. We benefited enormously from the lessons that we learned from Europe, from South America, from Africa, from other national models, including we learned a ton from the ETUI, Isabelle. So thank you for that. And that what we concluded is that rewriting labor law in a manner that enables workers to countervail the power of corporations can be a critical start to building a more equitable economy and politics. Our conclusion was that you need a labor law that enables workers to have voice at every level that corporations influence their lives. So yes, co-determination rights are critical, but it has to be part of an integrated system of labor law where workers have power at the workplace, at the level of the sector, at the level of the corporation, at the level of the democracy. Many countries, many people who represent countries on this call have systems like that. The United States decidedly does not, but that's what we intend to build. It's important for me to say that Clean Slate was not a project based on nostalgia for the past. It was not an attempt to reconstruct either the nation or the labor movement of 70 years ago. This could not have been the project because US politics and the US economy were unacceptably exclusionary at that time. They continue to be unacceptably exclusionary throughout our history. Access to wealth and political power has been unforgivably shaped by racial and gender discrimination, by discrimination based on immigration status, by sexual orientation and gender discrimination, and by ableism. So the project of Clean Slate was to design a new labor law capable of empowering all workers to demand an equitable democracy and a genuinely equitable economy. I don't want to try to summarize all of our recommendations. I can put the report in the chat. Let me just touch on the general outline. So, consistent with Clean Slate's emphasis on inclusion, our first recommendation is that before anything else, labor law has to expand its coverage. That is to say, expand the scope of workers for whom it offers protection, for whom it offers a mechanism for achieving voice. In the United States, that means addressing the historical exclusions that were based on and still perpetuate racial and gender oppression, including occupational exclusions of agricultural workers and domestic workers, exclusions based on immigration status. And it also means to affirmatively ensure that all workers can build the kind of power we describe. So having started with inclusion, we then move to the level of the workplace. This will be the most obvious point, but giving workers a voice at work advances the goal of bringing democratic values into the workplace and plays a critical role in counteracting what otherwise is a sphere defined by autocratic managerial rule. And that kind of autocratic managerial rule is in fact the norm in US workplaces. More than 90%, actually more than 93% now of private workplaces in the United States are non-union. Of course, workplace voice has always been central to labor law. The problem is that US labor law has had too narrow a vision of the scope of this right. We've given workers a binary choice, either an exclusive collective bargaining union or nothing. And our labor law has made it so difficult to choose an exclusive bargaining union that most workers are left with nothing. So Clean Slate proposes giving workers a menu of representational choices: workplace monitors, works councils, members-only unions, and exclusive representative unions, and making it far easier for workers to choose all of these. The other thing I'll say about workplace bargaining is that the range of issues over, and this goes to something Isabelle said, the range of issues over which workers have the right to bargain has been extremely narrow in the United States. We address this issue by proposing to expand significantly the scope of bargaining subjects and expanding those subjects to include what are now considered community issues on subjects ranging from affordable housing to climate change. Okay, now while workplace voice and power are critical, the history of the past 5 decades in the US teaches us that they're not enough. As our labor markets have evolved and as employment relationships have fissured, it's increasingly difficult for many workers to build any power at the workplace level. And workplace bargaining is and always has been exceedingly tough in disaggregated industries like domestic work, in which workers of color and women are disproportionately represented. So Clean Slate addresses these issues by recommending that in addition to more robust protection for workplace organizing and bargaining, American labor law provide a system of sectoral bargaining, obviously very familiar to most of those on the call, quite foreign to the United States. Okay. Finally, Clean Slate, as Ewan mentioned, recognizes that corporate power is of course exercised in the boardroom and in our democracy, and so recommends ways of expanding worker power in both these spheres. This means, among other things, significant levels of representation on corporate boards, plus supermajority voting rules for corporate level decisions with the greatest impact on workers' lives. And it means, among other things, paid time off to vote and to participate in civic activity. So that, in a very tight nutshell, is the aspirational part of what I have to say, what labor law ought to look like. Getting there in the United States is exceedingly tough sledding because of at least two reasons. Legislative gridlock, which is compounded by this filibuster rule we have here. Happy to talk about that. I also just want to mention the Supreme Court and the reemergent problem of judicial supremacy here. So our Supreme Court in the last handful of years has begun to focus its attention on ways that the US Constitution can be deployed or weaponized, in the words of Justice Kagan, to undermine the labor movement. We had a case called Janus, where the court said the First Amendment prohibits public sector employers from requiring workers to pay a fee to a union. And just this last term, in a case called Cedar Point, the Supreme Court revived an old doctrine called takings, which means that the government can't take property without compensating its owner, and used that constitutional principle to say that a state cannot require employers to allow union organizers to come onto company property to talk to workers, that it's unconstitutional to say that union organizers have a right to come onto company property to talk to union organizers without paying the company for the right to do that. So these two cases are important in their own right, but they point to a bigger problem, which is essentially that this Supreme Court now has the power and the inclination to essentially invalidate all progressive legislation that we can think of in the United States. My colleague Mike Klarman put it this way: it's easy to imagine this court concocting constitutional. Oh, am I still there? Okay, my screen went blank. Easy to imagine this
emphatically still here.
Okay, constitutional arguments against virtually every measure a progressive administration might pursue. So that's a way of saying we desperately need a radically redefined labor law, and it's very difficult to imagine getting one without doing something about judicial review in the United States. Done.
Thanks, Ben. You brought us right to the mountaintop there, and then you reminded us it's really, really cold when you get to the top of the mountain. The Supreme Court has turned up the refrigeration. Thank you for that terrific presentation. All three really wonderful presentations. We have some time left for conversations about these, and there has been active talk in chat, but I've encouraged people to put questions in the Q&A. I don't see any questions in Q&A yet, so let me see if I can formulate one that and I'll focus Ewan on the three parts of the ILO convention that you were urging. There's a governance piece, a management piece, and then a capital, ownership piece. And there are strands of at least the first two of those in the other presentations as well, focused on the European setting and on the US setting. And I wonder, coming to this central theme about where is the voice of workers. So I wonder if each of you could say something about where you see collective action by workers now in any of the settings that you're operating in and paying attention to, that focuses on any one or all of those three themes. Where is the movement? Where are the most promising parts of movement to address either the governance piece or the management piece or the capital ownership and guidance piece. Maybe Ewan, we could start with you.
Great question. So the connection between co-determination and collective bargaining is really fundamental. I mean, one really good example recently is I'm not sure if they're calling it a union yet, I'm not sure if they're calling it strikes yet, but the staff at Google did a walkout, which I think is a strike. One of the things that they were asking for is representation on in their boardroom, and also as part of a larger campaign about anti-discrimination and workplace practices that really shouldn't happen. And so collective bargaining for corporate change has been it's been there for a long time. Some of the most successful examples were in Germany, again, for end of the First World War and the Second World War. They got co-determined legislation through collective bargaining and strike action. In pension funds, jointly managed pension funds by employers and unions or workers, almost always started with collective bargaining, and then what happens is legislation sort of confirms the best practice. And if I could just say a tiny bit more about capital very briefly, because it's often forgotten. I mean, it's so fundamental that within even a co-determined company, you've got labor representatives, but I mean, who are the capital representatives? Who are shareholders running companies? And the answer is it's usually BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard in the United States, also Britain, Canada. In the European continent, it's Deutsche Bank, Commerzbank, UniCredit, Societe Generale, and they're all holding other people's money. But usually the money is coming up through the investment chain from workers' capital, through pension funds, life insurance, and mutual funds. So you've got to change the nature of capital in order to change the nature of the employer's constitution.
Great. Thanks so much. Isabelle, did you want to reflect on this? You're on mute, Isabelle.
Yeah, no, I'm not anymore. Is it okay like that?
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course, we have to move on the issue of governance. I think this is one of the lessons also, if need be, from the crisis. So we need to have an inclusive governance, and clearly here what we have proposed and for which the all ETUC and affiliates are moving ahead, as I mentioned, with the European Parliament. It was we call the escalator principle, by which for us the participation of workers in boardrooms would be according to the size of the business. So from business were small companies with 50 to 250 employees, that we would have 2 to 3 workers representative. When we move to companies between 250 and 1,000 employees, we would move to 1/3 of the board consisting of at least 9 members of board members being employee representative. And of course, for big businesses, more than 1,000 employees, we would go for indeed parity of the seats on the board. This is, of course, one dimension where we really need to move. But what we need to invest is, of course, I understand strengthening labor law to make sure that we are not deconstructing what we have, what we call the acquis communautaire in principle in Europe. But we have to move and investigate other dimensions that are impacting labor law very much. And here I speak about competition policies, for example. Because what we see here is that there is clearly a move to redefine, for example, what is collective bargaining for self-employed being potentially employers. And here, when they, under the current rules, when they are doing collective agreements, there are cartels agreements, and that's not okay. That's not reflecting the reality at all, in particular because cartel agreements are fixing prices on the market, whereby collective agreements are fixing working conditions and health and safety at the workplace. So, and here we do see that these attempts are clearly damaging the protection of workers, and the other dimensions that you have clearly seen is to try to deconstruct what we already have, and in particular to fragment the workforce and workers in platform workers, gig workers, self-employed and employees, for example. And then you mentioned clearly some of them are totally out of those democratic structure. Why? Civil servant. Can you explain why? Seafarers in Europe, for example, So I think here we do need to see that instead of fragmentations, we need to have this very embracing protection for workers. And of course, what is key is the democratic structure that are the basis for their participations in the way decisions are taken, exactly because those decisions are impacting directly their future, impacting directly the way they can live or not out of their work. So in-work poverty is clearly something that we cannot afford anymore, whereby we know it is business model that we find outside. And in particular, when it comes to the use and abuse of digitalization in the workplace, but also when it comes to the use and abuse of subcontracting to externalize the risk, and in particular, the labor costs. And here we have to clearly shift in terms of our understanding that labor is not a commodity and labor is not a cost. Labor is an investment in the future, and particularly also an investment in our present if we want to have any future on this planet.
So speaking of the future, this session doesn't have one. I mean, that's an ungentle way of saying, unfortunately, we're out of time. I feel like we're just at the beginning of this conversation, but we're at the quarter of the hour where we have to stop. I do want to thank all three of you. It's hard for me to remember an occasion recently when I learned as much in so short a period of time as I learned in this session. It was really amazing. Thank you so much for the presentations and for the really important contribution to the conversation about our democratized theme on the discussion about work, and also there was a little decommodify and decarbonize along with democratize. So thank you all. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Well done.
Wonderful session. Thank you. Yes.